Hey everybody, and welcome back to Frontend Expert. In this video, we will be discussing fetch, or more generally, how we can interact with the server. So if we look at this HTML file, all we have is an H1 that says fetch, and then we have a form. It has a label that says name, as well as this input with the type of text, where we can input the name, and finally a submit button. And then if we come back to the JavaScript, we have 4 APIs listed out here, and these are APIs that were already implemented. We could imagine that these came from a backend developer, and they gave us these 4 different APIs. So the APIs are the base API, which is simply a GET API that returns some text. We have a JSON API, so this is going to work just like the base API, except it returns JSON instead of standard text. Then we have a POST API, which we can send data to. And finally, we have a slow API, which is a GET API, very similar to the base API, but it's very slow, and we can see how to work with that in a moment, and how we can deal with APIs that might not be super responsive. Okay, so to make a request to the API, what we can do is we can call fetch, so this is a function provided by the browser, and then inside of fetch, we can say base API. So this is going to take in the URL, so the path to the API, that we want to request from, and by default, it's going to make a GET request. So for now, let's just console log out the result here. So we can say console.log of fetch. And you can see we get a pending promise back. And this kind of makes sense. If we make a request to a server, it's going to take some time, and we don't want the entire browser to just have to wait for this request to come back. So it happens asynchronously, returning a promise, and then once that promise has fulfilled, we know that the server has returned some information to us. So let's get rid of this console log. And what I want to do instead is add a then statement. So this is a standard promise. So that means we could say .then, and then inside of this .then, for now, let's simply console.log to see what we get back. And we can run this code, and you can see we get this response object back. Okay, so this means that we have this response object, and we need to do something with it. So I'm going to get rid of the console log, and we can say response, and these response objects have a function known as text. So I can say response.text, and what this text function does is it gets the text from the response. So rather than this whole object with lots of information, we can get the actual response text. And then let's say .then, and here we can simply console log. So now we can run this again, and you'll see we get hello world. So again, what we did is we requested the base API, which is this GET request up here. And then we called .then, and we said we want to take the response object and call the response.text function on it. And then what we did was we logged out the result of this call. And just like any other promise chain, we can add some error handling here. So let's add a catch block. And we can move all of these onto their own lines just to make it easier to read. And then inside of the catch block, what we want to do is take in this error message, and we can do something with it. So for example, I can do console.error, and inside of here, we can do oh no, and then we can concatenate this with the error. Okay, now one other thing I want to mention here is that this is asynchronous. So for example, I could say console.log after fetch here. And just like any other promise, this after fetch code is going to run before we get into any of these callback functions because of the fact that this is returning a promise. So when I run this, we get after fetch first before we ever log out hello world. So fetch is not blocking in any way. It will essentially happen in the background, and then the callback functions we pass to then will only run after the fetch returned promise has been resolved. Now, sometimes these APIs also can take in some parameters. And the way we pass in parameters to a URL, so we have 2 options. The first is going to be simple string concatenation. So for example, I can concatenate a string, and we always start query parameters with a question mark. Then after the question mark, we put whatever the key to this query parameter is. So this one takes a first name, then we have an equal sign and whatever the value is, so I'll pass Connor. And then we use the ampersand, so the and sign. And after this, we can add another query parameter. So here we also have a last name, and I will pass Ardman here. And you'll see now if I run this code again, we get hello world, your name is Connor Ardman. This is coming back from the server when we called this base API. Now you might be saying, this is pretty hard to read, and it is. So what we can do instead is we can actually use this URL object. So I can say const URL, and I can set this equal to a new URL, and we will pass in the base API. But then what we can do is we can do URL.searchParameters.set, and this takes in a key and a value. So I can set the first name, and I will set this equal to Connor. And then we can do the same thing, set the last name, and I will set this equal to my last name as well. And now instead of this concatenation, we can pass in the URL object. So I can pass in the URL, fix the parentheses here, and we can run this and we get the same result as before. Now, most of the time, this is how we will communicate with the server using JavaScript, but I did want to show that there is another way to do this, so I will comment this code out for a moment. Now let's come up here, and what we're going to do instead is a const request, and we can set this equal to a new XML HTTP request. And an XML HTTP request is very similar to how we work with fetch. It is simply an older version of the same thing. So this is how we did things before fetch was added. And because XML HTTP requests are an older version of fetch, they don't use promises. So instead what we do is we say request.addEventListener. So we add an event listener, and I want to add a load event listener, and I will make an anonymous function here. And inside of the anonymous function, I can say console.log, and we do this.response text. And what this does is essentially the same thing as the response text function we had before. It gets the response text from whatever came back from the server. And next, what we need to do is we need to actually make the request. So we open a request by saying request.open, and we pass in first the type of request we want. So we want a GET request in this case, and then we pass in the URL. So I want the base API URL in this case. And then we have to say request.send to actually send off this HTTP request. And you will see now we get this hello world text once again. We can also listen to error events. So instead of load, I could say error, and this is going to listen for any network errors that occurred. But for now, I will just remove this code and we will go back to our fetch code. Okay, so next what I want to show is how we can use async and await instead of using the then chains. So let's create an asynchronous function. So I'm going to say async function, and I will call this function main for now. And we can open up this function. I will also remove the after fetch console log because we won't need that anymore. Okay, so now inside of main, what we need to do is we need to make this fetch request. So I'm going to make this fetch request here, but instead of simply making the request, I'm actually going to save this in a variable. So I'm going to say const response, and I will set this equal to the await value of fetch. So this function is going to wait for this promise to resolve, and when it does, it's going to save the response object in this response constant. Next, I can get the text, so I can say const text and set this equal to await of response.text. So once again, we are taking this promise code, and instead of using .then, we are waiting for this promise to resolve as well, and its value will be saved in this text constant. And then finally, we could do console.log of text. And then, of course, we need to call the main function. And the last step we need to take is to emulate the catch block here. So what we can do is to say try, and inside of the try block, we will move all of this code here. And then we can catch any errors. So I can say catch, and we will catch an error. And if we catch an error, what we're going to do is, in this case, the same thing we did here. We will call this console error, and we will pass in the oh no plus the error message. Okay, so now we can get rid of this fetch code, and we can also move this URL code inside of the main function if we want, so that it is not global. And now if I run this code, you'll see we get hello world, your name is Connor Ardman. So this is roughly working the same way as the previous code we had with the then chain. Now, one more thing I wanted to show here is with this response object, there are a few fields that can be useful. So I'm going to console.log. We have response.status for one. And then we also have this field that is response.ok. So I'm going to run this code and you can see we get a status of 200 and OK of true. So status is going to give us the status code of the request. Anything in the 200 range means it was OK. And then we have response.ok, which is going to be set to true if the status was in the 200 range. If it wasn't in the 200 range, then response.ok is going to be false. So this can be helpful if in a scenario where you had a bad response come back, you wanted to handle it in a certain way, then you can use an if check around either response.ok or specific response statuses. Okay, so next, let's remove this code. And what I want to look at is how to, instead of using this URL here, so I will get rid of this code for now. Instead, I want to try using the JSON API. So I will copy this into our fetch call. And now because this API returns JSON instead of response.text, we're going to use response.json. And I will call this the obj, and then we can console log out the obj here. And you'll see that we end up logging out this object. It has the name of Connor, and we have a course of frontend expert in this object. So this is just the object that was returned to us from the API. Now, if I did do response.text instead, and I made this const text, and we console log out the text, you'll see we get the same object, but we get it as one big string. So what we can do instead is we can use this function json.parse, and then we pass in a JavaScript object notation string, which is what this is, and I can pass in the text, and you'll see we once again get that same object. So this is essentially doing the exact same thing. It is just skipping a step if we use response.json instead. So if you know you're getting a JSON response back, I would recommend doing it this way if you never need that object as a string, and then you can sort of skip this function call, and it looks a little bit cleaner in your code, and we get the same output. And if you're not sure what the response type is going to be, you can actually get it from the response object. So if we did console.log, we can say response.headers, and then we can call get on the headers. So the headers object contains all of the different headers that came with the request. And in this case, we want to get the content type. So I can run this code, and you can see we get a content type of application JSON with the character set of UTF-8. So we could use this content type header, parse it, and then say if it was application JSON, run response.json. If it wasn't, run response.text. But most of the time, you should know what the API is going to return to you, so this shouldn't be an issue. So for now, let's get rid of this console log statement. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to try the post API instead. So let's change the JSON API to call the post API. And when we call post API, we need to tell fetch that we are making a post request. So after the name to the URL, we can add another argument. And this argument is going to be an object. We usually just define it inline, but you don't have to. You can create an options object and then pass it in as a variable as well. Some people prefer to do it that way. But for now, let's just do this inline. And the first thing we need to do here is we need to define a method. So in this case, we want the method to be post because we don't want to make a GET request anymore. We want to make a POST request. Next, when we make a POST request, we need to send some data, and we do this on the body. So we can say body, and we're going to set the body equal to a string that is JSON. So in this case, I'm going to say json.stringify. So this is the opposite of json.parse. It takes an object and turns it into a JavaScript object notation string. So in this case, we can pass in some data. And then what we need to do is we need to define this data object. So I will come up here and let's say const data. I will set this equal to an object literal. And all this post request takes in is an object with a name. So I will pass in the name of Connor, add a semicolon at the end here. And then after the body, we have one more option we will need, and that is going to be the headers. So we need to tell the server what content type we are giving it. In this case, we're giving it an object. We're giving it JSON. So headers itself is going to be an object. So we can create an object here, and we can say we have a content type, and we will set this equal to, we will say application/JSON, and then we add a semicolon, and we need to also define the character set. So I will say char set equals UTF-8. And this post API actually doesn't return JSON, it returns standard text. So I will change this to be response.text once again, and we can add text to our console log. And now we can run this code, and you can see we get your name is Connor. Now, one thing we can do to clean up this code a bit is instead of passing headers as an object like this, what we can do instead is we can say const headers and set this equal to a new headers object. Then within this headers object, all we need to do is say headers.append, and we can add whatever headers we want. So for example, I can add the content type here, and then we pass in the value as a second argument. So in this case, I want the value to be this same string we had. So I will add this in here, add a semicolon to the end, and then we can, instead of saying headers like this, what we can do is we can simply say headers. This is the same thing as doing headers set equal to our headers object, but since they have the same name, all we need to do is add the name of headers here, and this is going to get the same result. So you can see we get your name is Connor once the server has responded. And again, if you prefer, you can take this entire object and you can save it into a variable. So some people prefer to say options here, and then you can say const options and set this equal to that object we had. This is also going to work the same way. It is simply another way to write the same code. Okay, so next what I want to do is I want to look at how we can interact with a form in HTML. So we have this form that has the name input, and that input is the same value that the post API takes in. So rather than hard coding this value of the data in our JavaScript, what we can do instead is we can do this through the form in the HTML. So the first thing we need to do is we need to add an event listener to the form. So I'm going to say const form and set this equal to document.query selector of the form. So this will get the form. And then we can say form.add event listener, and we're going to listen to the submit event. And when the form is submitted, so this is going to be whenever you click the submit button, we are going to let's call it on submit. Okay, so I'm going to repurpose this main function as on submit. So we don't need the main function anymore, and we don't need to call the main function at the bottom. And then inside of this on submit, we're going to have a lot of the same code, but it will be a bit different. So for now, I'm going to erase this code up here because our options we pass are going to be a little bit different, but we will be using the same API. Now, when we use the submit event, the first thing we want to do is take in the event. And what I want to do is prevent default on this event. So I'm going to say event.prevent default. The reason for this is that by default, when you submit a form, it is just going to go to the URL that you submitted it to. So it's going to essentially end up refreshing the page if there isn't a URL specified in the HTML. And we don't want that. We want to make our own fetch request and handle it in our JavaScript. And then the only other thing we need to do is we need to define the options. So I will say const options and set this equal to an object literal once again. And we still need a method, so I need to say that this is a post request. And then what we need to do here is we need to add a body. So in this case, instead of adding JSON, what we're going to do is we're going to add a new form data object here. And form data is going to take in as a parameter the form. So I can pass in the entire form here. And what this does is it essentially creates an object that has all of the key value pairs from the HTML. So if we go to the HTML, you can see that we had this input and it has a name parameter. So the name is going to be the key, and then whatever the value is, so whatever we have typed in is going to be the value. So that is what is going to be our body here. Now, it is worth noting that form data is different from JSON, so you have to know what your server expects. In this case, our post API server can use either form data or JSON, so it is fine to just pass the form data here. So now we can add a semicolon at the end here, save this, and if I come over to the browser and we add in a name, so I will add the name of Connor, hit submit, and you'll see in the console we get your name is Connor. So this is essentially working the same way, but instead of taking the value that we had hard-coded, it is instead using the value from inside of the form. Okay, so let's come back over to the JavaScript here. And what I want to show next is how to use this slow API. So how to deal with an API that doesn't come back very quickly. So what we can do is remove this code. We aren't going to be using the form for this. The slow API is just a GET request. So we can simplify this code again, go back to calling it main. Inside of main, we don't need these options, anything like that. And instead, all we need is the slow API, and we can get rid of the options as well. All of the defaults will be fine. And at the end of this file, let's once again call main. So if I run this code, you'll see nothing is happening, but eventually it will come back. So this API is just very slow. It's going to take a few seconds, and then if we stare at the console long enough, we will get hello world. But we might want to add a timeout to say, if this takes more than 2 seconds, just abort it. We don't want this request anymore. And the way we can handle this is by creating what we call an abort controller. So I can say const abort controller, and I will set this equal to a new abort controller. And then what we want to do is add a set timeout. So I'm going to say set timeout, and what we want to do here is abort the abort controller. So I will say abort controller dot abort, and I will call this function after 2 seconds. So if we've gone 2 seconds and the request does not come back, we are going to abort the request. And then all we have to do is in the fetch API, we will add options once again, and the only option we will need is this option called signal. So this signal takes in the abort controller dot signal. So this is a property of the abort controller that we pass in, and whenever this abort is called, it is going to now abort this entire fetch request, and we will actually fall into the catch block. So now I can run this code, and after 2 seconds, you will see we get oh no, and we get this abort error, the user aborted a request. So we never got our result back from the server, we instead ended up with this abort error. And in the case that you are actually working with an API this slow, in the catch block you would want to do something more graceful to show the user on the page that something has gone wrong, and to maybe give them some alternative. But anyways, with that, that's going to be the end of this video on fetch and making API requests to the server. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.